Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. President Trump at last night's task force meeting talking about the payroll protection program and his desire to see another $250 billion put into it after more than 1 million loans totaling north of $200 billion have already been dispersed.
We want to take care of our workers. We'll worry about other things and other pet projects of Democrats and also Republicans later. But it's been a tremendously successful program. I think you see it. The banks have stepped up, hundreds of thousands of loan applications approved. Money is going out. It's been a tremendous program. Really, it's been. And obviously, it was at a point where we're almost, the money will be expired, and we could use a refill for the workers. We want to be able to make sure that small businesses stay open, John, and I think that'll happen.
For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Bethany McLean. She is a contributing editor for Vanity Fair, and she is also somebody who has built a career out of documenting economic catastrophes. The co-author of the bestseller, The Smartest Guys in the Room, on Enron. She wrote a book about the financial bubble that burst, leading to the Great Recession of 2008, particularly focused on housing, Fannie and Freddie. So much experience watching over the last couple of decades how government policies have cratered the economy in various exciting ways. Bethany, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
So your piece in Vanity Fair zeroes in on private equity. You write about this being perhaps Groundhog Day, too big to fail, 2020 version. And you suggest that private equity firms are the banks of the corona crisis. Can you explain that statement?
Sure. Well, there's a lot of controversy started over the idea that private equity firms would get access to some of the disaster relief funds, and people said, "Well, wait. These firms have made billionaires of their executives, and they have, at last estimate, over $1 trillion of dry powder of cash that could be invested. Why do they need part of the government money?" And my point was that private equity has become so deeply woven into the very foundation of our economy, like it or not. Private equity firms own a fair number of small businesses, and pension funds have staked their future performance by investing in private equity funds, hoping for returns. And so we're all leveraged to the performance of private equity. So my point was, private equity firms are the banks of the corona crisis. They're too big to fail, and at least if they're going to get government money, maybe we should extract from them some promises to do better in the future.
It sounds like you better beat Aaron Sorkin to the book on the topic here. But on the private equity funds, aren't they concerned about not just the $2 trillion, but the $4 trillion in Fed backstops, with potentially more to come? That the government is going to crowd out private investment by buying up all of this debt, and limit their. I mean, they may have the backstop, and they may not be able to fail, but they also may not be able to succeed and generate the kind of returns they're used to generating.
Well, I don't know the answer to that. We'll have to see what happens. Private equity firms made fortunes after the global financial crisis. Not only did the Fed's low interest rate policy bail them out from bad investments they'd made before the crisis, investments made at too high a price and with too much debt, but the Fed's lowering of interest rates helped bail them out of those investments. And these guys are smart. They'll figure out a way to use government money to continue their march through the economy. And so I guess my point is that's going to happen anyway once the government funds are made available. So isn't there a way to do it? I mean, like the government bailout of the banks or not, the banks have been what happened subsequently made the banks a great deal safer. And so they are as fine as they could be going into this crisis, and can't we do the same thing, at least if we're going to make this money available, is try to do it in a smart way.
It's reminiscent of back in 2008 the bailout of AIG to essentially save Goldman Sachs, which people like me violently opposed. It seems like you're suggesting that this sort of is a backdoor way that's happening again. And here I violently oppose not just the billionaire bailouts for billionaires, but unfunded pension liabilities like in
Right.
Illinois that where states and cities made their beds pre-pandemic and then getting bailed out by everybody for the decisions they made. Same thing with the politicians as with the billionaires.
Yeah, I mean this crisis is interesting and horrible in that it is bringing home the proverbial chickens to roost, right? Because a lot of these problems were pre-existing in our economy, from underfunded pension plans to too much debt to our unhealthiness that has allowed this virus to spread with such rapidity. And so it's really highlighting all of these pre-existing flaws.
Well,
It's
Bethany,
an evil virus in that sense.
yeah, sorry for stepping on your toes there. What are your thoughts on the bailouts for airline industry, hotels, the cruise line industry? I mean, is it even going to be enough for them to survive?
I don't know. I don't think anybody knows what's going to happen from here on in. Some component of that depends on when we start lifting the lockdowns and whether people are willing to go back to life as a semblance of what it was. And I think there's so much fear out there now that even if the lockdowns were lifted, it's not like people are going to say, "Okay, great," and go back to life the way they lived it. So we're in totally uncharted waters. I don't think anybody has a clue.
So much as we're getting a bit of a civics lesson when it comes to, say, our representative Republican form of government and federalism, it seems like this is an opportunity to get a little bit of an economics lesson, including just exactly how our economy is comprised, how it operates. We've heard from Danny Myers, the founder of Shake Shack. He gave a great dissertation in 60 Minutes a couple of weeks ago about concentric circles around his businesses. You have to understand how interconnected things are. And you're offering an education here in terms of the composition of a private sector as it pertains to small business in this piece in Vanity Fair. You reference the Milken Institute report that gives you a sense of private equity's stake, or some would say outsized, but private equity's presence in the American economy when it comes to smaller businesses, the fewer than 500 employee businesses.
Yes, so it's massive. They provide employment. Private equity-owned businesses employ a lot of people. It comprises, I think the number in the piece was 5% of GDP. I mean, it's enormous, and I'm not sure that's. I think that has allowed the few to extract a lot of money at the expense of the many. So I'm not necessarily a big fan of private equity, and I think it has been enabled over the last decade in particular by incredibly cheap debt, which once again has been a policy that has benefited the few and not necessarily the many. So in no way, shape, or form am I smiling at this, but we are where we are, and I'm not sure. I'm really not sure how to get out of this. I don't think anybody is.
But just to be fair to private equity too, I don't want to go. I want to try and be even-handed here. I mean, there is a role that private equity can play that's productive, and that's getting companies to operate more efficiently.
That absolutely is, and that was always the old promise of private equity, right? Is that having owners who would allow a company to be private could allow them to focus on the long term, and by optimizing the capital structure, you could make a business function more efficiently. But I think some of that got lost in the debt bubble of recent years, where if you talk to companies that were owned by private equity, they were under every bit as much pressure as a publicly traded company to generate results now, so the private equity owner could flip it. And cheap debt covered up a multitude of problems, right? And so there's some interesting analysis in the piece, or at least links to it, about how little private equity owners actually did to improve businesses. So that original idea behind private equity, which was a valid one, got really corrupted over the last decade, in my view.
While we have you, and since you have many areas of expertise when it comes to economic calamities, I don't know if it's an expertise you sought out, but you certainly have it now covering it, housing and the steps that have been taken with Fannie and Freddie and FHA for preventing, putting a halt on foreclosures and the other measures they've taken to provide relief in this time. We've talked a lot about the banks. We've talked about the private sector. What about the housing market now 12 years removed from the Great Recession? where the Fannie and Freddie stand in particular and the measures that are being taken, the potential impacts or concerns there?
Yeah, I think there's an enormous amount of concern there, and whether the steps are sufficient, necessary, something is necessary. Whether it's sufficient depends on what course we take from here on in. In no circumstances is it good to have people being turned out of their homes, right? So I think we have to do everything we can to keep a roof over people's heads.
Well, but it's just giving a little bit of, because one of the things that's already under discussion now, or sort of areas of discussion, what are the lessons that we should learn coming out of this across a range of sectors? And that's the same thing we did. What are the lessons we should learn from the bubble bursting in 2008? And the suggestion that with respect to housing, maybe we didn't learn some of those lessons. And I wonder if perhaps we may be revisiting some of the lessons we didn't learn coming out of '08.
Yeah, well, I think one big overriding lesson that we seem not to have learned coming out of 2008 is that too much debt is bad and some level of redundancy is good, right? And so you can think of, I guess, one way to think of the crisis of 2008 was one of too much debt, and any redundancy had been stripped out of the system such that it was actually quite frail once a contagion started. And that's kind of where we are again today in a different way. In that sense, the contagion was in the financial industry, and now the contagion is it's through the virus and then into the economy at large. But it's revealed an economy where it's heavily indebted and where any sort of give has been stripped out, whether it's out of supply chains, whether it's out of the government balance sheet, whether it's out of businesses themselves, whether it's out of people's lives and people's inability to economically withstand any kind of shock. So I think maybe one thing we should think about is efficiency. That a much prided word, make everything more and more efficient, but that also means making the system more frail, such that when any kind of crisis starts, it cracks right away. So maybe that's one lesson that we didn't learn the last time around.
The importance of rainy day funds, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah.
Bethany McLean, she's a contributing editor for Vanity Fair. Check out her piece, Too Big to Fail, COVID-19 edition, which I tweeted out at Dan Proft. Bethany, thanks for joining us as always. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on.
And she joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
The stories you need to know to start your day. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Balance.